Welcome everyone to our program, Lessons from the Life of Madam C.J. Walker. I am delighted to be here with my old friend, and Lewis and I are both old. We worked as teenagers at a summer camp, I think starting in 1979. And back then, I guess we were just two teenage knuckleheads. Both of us are grown up and have accumulated various degrees of wisdom. Lewis, a lot of wisdom. Myself, maybe not as much as Lewis, and at least on this topic, I recognize Lewis's expertise and am thrilled that we have Lewis with us tonight. So I am hosting this. My name is Chuck Hall. I am a coach with my company, Bizinuum LLC, and I am delighted to have Lewis Jones here with us tonight. And Lewis, I will take off the slide and allow you to introduce yourself far better than I can.
Well, good evening, everybody. As Chuck said, my name is Lewis Jones. I have been a working anthropologist, cultural anthropologist, and historical archaeologist for the past 17 years, although recently I have moved over to working in the nonprofit sector, working for the American Legion. I've been an educator throughout most of that time. But how I got there is probably part of my story, because actually, I did the typical things most of us did. I went to high school, then I left for the Air Force, did 6 years in the Air Force, and while there, I fell in love with computers. So I ended up working in the IT industry after I left the Air Force for about 15 years before I decided it was time for me to finish my education. I'd done a year and a half of college at Villanova before going to the Air Force, but really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. But when I went back, I of course have a love for history. And that was one of the major things I was doing in college. And by root of that, I came to the field of archaeology and cultural anthropology because they're so much entwined. And where I went to school, it was unique because I went to school in Indianapolis, Indiana. And the school that I went to is called Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, although now it's going to be Indiana University, Indianapolis. And it was built right on the near west side of Indianapolis, on a neighborhoods that used to be fully Black neighborhoods. And funny enough, right near the location where Madam C.J. Walker created her business back in the 1900s. And I heard a lot about, growing up, about Madam Walker, knew a lot about her, but realized I never knew as much about her as I should, simply because of the fact that this was a woman who did everything on her own. So got with one of my professors, and we discussed it when I went on to grad school, what would be a great way to do some research locally. So that brought us to the idea, well, no one's done research on Madam Walker. No one's looked at her home. No one's looked at the factory that she built to really understand what was going on there, the effects it had on the community, the effects it had on culture and society in general. And so for me, that became the main purpose that I had all through grad school. And even to this day, to think about what she did, how she did it, why she did it, and the effects it can have on us today.
Lewis, let me just interject a second there. I think most of us have some degree of familiarity with who Madam C.J. Walker is. Could you just give us like a brief overview of her story, and then continue with with your train of thought?
Okay. Well, first of all, Madam C.J. Walker was the youngest of 12 siblings. All of her siblings were born into slavery. She was born immediately after the Civil War. At that point in time, she was born and raised in the South in Mississippi. By the time she was 17, she was married with a child and widowed by the age of 19. So she found herself alone raising a child. She had a brother who had moved to St. Louis, so she joined him there, and she found work working as a laundress. Part of the problem with laundry back then is the chemicals that were used for doing laundry. Lye was a major ingredient, along with mercury and other things. And most people who were doing laundry lost their hair. As part of that process, she was trying to figure out ways to keep her hair, to grow it back. So she started working on different ideas with going to a local pharmacist And out of that, she came up with some simple concoctions that she tried on her hair. Eventually, she struck on one that actually did exactly what she was looking at. It restored her hair, grew it back, and actually made it thicker, much softer, and actually more manageable, and actually, as what some people better looking. And she realized that if she could do that for herself, she should be able to do this for other people. And so she eventually moved from St. Louis to Indianapolis after going, and actually let me change it. She went to look where should she start her business? Where could she put her headquarters? She looked at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She looked in Denver, Colorado. She eventually settled in Indianapolis, Indiana, simply because it was the crossroads of all the major rail lines that crisscross the United States. And so because of this, she centered herself in Indianapolis, in a community that was at that time very integrated, very mixed, but over time it would change. And one of the things that made me want to really get into studying is understanding how that neighborhood changed over time, how she contributed to the changes in the neighborhood, but to make it better, to ensure that people who were living there had opportunities that would not have been given to them normally. Because again, one of the key parts about Madam Walker is this is a woman who was born in a time where, although nominally she's free, she's really not as free as you would think, because there are a lot of things she can and can't do. As a woman, most women at that point in time in history really relied on their husbands to actually be able to do anything. Matter of fact, women at that point in time were more or less possessions to their husbands. Husbands could physically abuse their wives, and in most cases, there was no punishment. Madam Walker, although married, her husband actually did not have much say in what she was doing with her business, because she ran the business. She's called Madam C.J. Walker, but her name is Sarah Breedlove. And Sarah chose the C.J. Walker moniker and the Madam moniker because it gave her a sense of authority. It made people look at her in a different way, and it accorded some respect to her because of the fact that she was a woman who could stand on her own. And so when I went to Indianapolis, moved to Indianapolis and went to school, finding out about this woman having a business there in Indianapolis, and one of the things I wanted to find is how many people in Indianapolis really knew anything about her. So I did surveys of over 1,000 people to find out that more people who came from outside of Indianapolis knew who she was than those who lived there. And which was kind of disheartening, because one of the big edifices in downtown Indianapolis is the Madam C.J. Walker Theater, which was built simply, and I'll tell more about that story, but it's built because of the fact that she couldn't go to a theater in Indianapolis, no matter how rich she was. But with that theater being there, it was a major part of early colored Black life in Indianapolis on the near west side. The near west side had the nickname of being basically Black Wall Street for that time. Every major business you could think of was found there. They had banks, they had doctors' offices, lawyers, pharmacies. Matter of fact, music was one of the main industries that came out of that part of Indianapolis. Jazz, people like Wes Walker, some of you might know who he is if you know anything about jazz music. He was a legendary guitarist who was born and raised in Indianapolis. Basketball was another major factor there. If you went to the near west side of Indianapolis, if you were anybody in the state of Indiana, when it came to basketball, they came down to that area to what was called the Dust Bowl, which was located not more than 150 yards from where Madam Walker actually had her house, because the best basketball players in the state all came there. So Larry Bird, Oscar Robertson, all of them played basketball there. So there's a lot of history in that area that people think about, but they tie it to more of the music industry. They tied it more to the sports industry, specifically basketball. But people didn't really think about what that edifice, that Walker Theater, why it was there, what it stood for. And so that created for me an interest in finding out more about who was this person, what is it she did, how did it affect people, and how does it still affect people today?
So Lewis, that is really interesting. So a question I have coming from that is, so tell us something about your research that maybe you found out, and also about the archaeology So that's kind of a leading question based on a conversation we had maybe a week ago.
Well, the funny part, as I was doing the research on Madam Walker, I learned a lot about what she did in the neighborhood and the contribution she made. But what was interesting as I was doing the archaeology, it really doesn't uncover a lot about Madam Walker as much as it does uncover a lot about life in general on the Near West Side at a time in history when things were changing, the dynamics were changing. One of
Lewis, let me interrupt you again. Sorry about that. So, for you, archaeology, like this is all in your head, right? And so for some of us, archaeology is like Indiana Jones, right? What was the archaeological research like? Like, what did you do, and then what did you find as a result of that?
Well, first of all, and believe it or not, I'm a big fan of Indiana Jones. But what he was a treasure hunter, a grave robber. Yes, he did some archaeology, but archaeology actually most of the time for archaeology, believe it or not, yes, we do dig in the dirt, and I did. But we spent as much time actually doing real research. We're spending a lot of time looking through old documents, looking through maps, looking through insurance papers. I spent a lot of time doing genealogical research, looking at the people who lived in and around the area, because this helps tell the story of what is actually going on these sites. So as part of what I was doing, I looked at insurance maps, Sanborn maps, which you can find in most major cities, which will tell you about the buildings and what's on the site. So I can locate privies, I can locate, any type of root cellars that might be there. And those are, of course, of things as archaeologists we're going to be interested in. And so as we started doing the archaeology, actually doing the digging, after we do all that research, we sit down and plan it out, we go out and we start digging. And before we can actually start digging, we have to remove everything on top. And that's the hard part. Because realistically, in this case, there was a parking lot sitting over where her property was, where her house was, where the stores that was sitting there, the school, and where her factory was. So we had to remove all of that blacktop. Then we still had to remove about another 6 to 12 inches of soil depth to get down to where she was, because archaeologically speaking, the most recent things are always on the top. To get to what's historical, you've got to go down. You got to go back in time. The only way to do that is to dig down. So to get back to the time frame in which she's living, I had to remove soil to get there. So in the end, we moved approximately 1.5 feet of soil and asphalt just to be able to do it. And actually, funny enough, I do have videos. If anybody ever wants to see them, I can share them with you. Would be too much for tonight, but I'd be happy to share them with people, showing the excavation, the removal of it. I took probably thousands of pictures all throughout the whole process. But once we get to the point where we can start doing soil, then we get to the nitty gritty. We have to lay out units, basically 4x6, 4x6, 6x6 foot units that we're going to dig in. And we start working down. So we're starting from the most recent era, going backwards. And as further we got back towards her time, that's where things started getting interesting, because we found some evidence of the factory. So we found diesel fuel that was in the soil. We found some remnants of the building, because when they tore it down, they just buried it all there. So we found the footer from her factory. We found the door handle from the doors of the factory. But what became more interesting was the things that were there that weren't related to them, because they told a story of a lived experience. So we found evidence of food items. So everything from shellfish, pork, beef. We found evidence of seeds. So people were growing vegetables. We found evidence of play, because there were handmade dice, some pieces of ceramics from dolls that were also there. We found evidence of hygiene, because we found remnants of an old wooden toothbrush handle. So there's a lot that we can tell about the lived experience. Now, we tie that all into, once we find that, we tie that all into what we can find in the historical record, and also looking into the genealogical records to look at who, based upon census records, who lived here at what time, where did they move, how were people living here, where were they moving to? And that told us a really unique story about the people who were there, because when we talk about the Near West Side of Indianapolis, most cases, we're talking about it as a predominantly Black neighborhood, because it was after about the 1920s. But prior to that, going back to about the 1850s to 1860s, that's when we have evidence of the first occupation of the site by anyone, based upon finding a Liberty Head nickel from 1870. And it tells us that there were people living there who actually were from mixed backgrounds. So we know there were people of German ancestry. Because there was a German grocery store right there. We found evidence from that they imported actual German beers from Frankfurt, because we have the shard remains of a nice ceramic beer bottle. Which for someone like me who lived in Germany for years, that was a great find. I loved that, because I actually had drank the beer because the company's still around. We found evidence that people shopped from catalogs. There were perfumes, Beaujolais, which is still around today, but was what back then you would have had to go to New York or Paris again. Someone was buying it and had it on that site and was left as a remnant. So we saw what kind of ceramic ware people were using in their homes. So we get a whole rich story about the life of people that were living there. And to me, that became interesting because it tied into how that neighborhood's changing, because they're living there. And then Madam Walker, who's very well off compared to most of the people who were living there prior, moves in and buys this big house right there on the main street, and creates her factory, creates her own school and everything right there. And so the question becomes, what effect was she having on this community as it changed? And so doing the archaeology, we were able to get a better idea of exactly how that change happened, how over time, and where people were working as that change was going on, because they were all working at the same slaughterhouse, basically. There was a slaughterhouse called Kingan's, which was located approximately a quarter of a mile away, that produced pork products. And we find a lot of evidence of people bringing home those choice parts of the pig to consume, and the remnants are left there in what they throw away. And of course, where we dug mostly, it's like we dug around the buildings, but I looked for privy chambers. And if you don't know what a privy chamber is basically an outhouse. So we went there and we went and dug there, and we took out what we could find, and that gave us a rich history, because we could go back. Because if you think about it, we're going back almost 100 years at that point in time to see what people were eating, what people were doing for their lives. And that to me was one of the most fascinating things, because it's not stuff we find in the history books.
That's really interesting. So Lewis, I'm going to prompt you with this. If I remember correctly, from one of the things you pointed out to me, that there wasn't, so you already brought the one element out, that there wasn't kind of a racial segregation, like we kind of think of when we think about Civil War times, right? And shortly thereafter. But you also brought out, economic similarities. I don't know if that's enough of a prompt for, if I remembered correctly.
Yeah, well, first of all, at that point, up from about 1870 up till about, let's say, 1920, that area is very integrated. And people would go into the greater area of Indianapolis for jobs, depending on who they were. A lot of people worked at similar factories. So the socioeconomic structure was very much the same. And what was interesting about it is the fact that no one thought about it being a problem as far as interactions between people of different races, different ethnicities. It wasn't until the rise of the Ku Klux Klan that changes. And basically, they create the first Black high school in Indianapolis. It's funded and built by the Ku Klux Klan. And of course, what was interesting, it goes on to be one of the most, it was the best school in the city. Almost all the teachers there had master's degrees or PhDs. The students graduated to go on to become business leaders in the community, lawyers, doctors. You think about anybody who's going to be in the middle class. This is where they're coming from. This is where they're going to school. And it's because of a mentality that says, as much as I'd say, we want to keep these Black guys away from these white girls. And that's really what it came down to. And that led to Christmas attics being built. And the school's still there today. It's a tech center for advanced students today. But at one point in time, if you were in a Black community, if you wanted to go to the best school in town, that was where you were going to go. Of course, out of it, it created some of the top athletes in the city. Some of the greatest athletes who played professional basketball happened to be African American. That's where they went to school in Indianapolis before they went to college everywhere else. But no matter who you were, if you were going to be someone important in the community, that's the school you went to. And it all came about because of racism. Now, the funny part is for Madam Walker, she gets there and as the dynamics are changing, she's realizing she's trying to set up a business, and it's not going to be that easy because one, she's a woman, two, she's Black, and she's got to find a supply chain. So what she did, whereas most businesses would set up and say, okay, I know who my suppliers are. She actually contacted international companies, national corporations to buy the products she needed to create her products. So companies like Jergens provided the tallow that was used to make hand lotions and face creams, hair creams that she might be using. And she went to other national companies to do the same thing. A lot of people on that in Indianapolis at that point in time were actually starting to shop through catalogs. We think about Sears, the Sears catalog today, but Sears catalog was just starting. But the catalog business started because people wanted to get products that they knew were good, that people didn't care what they looked like. The dollar was the same. So if they were buying flour at the local grocer, they wouldn't necessarily get the best grade of flour. It might have weevils in it. And pests. So they would order nationally from Gold Medal, and that would get them the flour to their homes. So people started shopping through catalogs to buy a lot of products. And that's really when the catalog movement started off, was really in that early 1900s, because people everywhere were saying, well, you know what? I go in here, they don't treat me right. They won't sell me products that I want. So entrepreneurs started saying, hey, well, we can run a catalog business. And that's how a lot of that happened. But Madam Walker was very smart because she used that to her benefit. It's one of the first things she did is started a door-to-door sales program with her products. She actually trained what she called her Walker women, her Walker agents, how to go to a person's house, demonstrate the product, and sell it to them. So before Avon was actually doing this, Walker agents were doing it. She also ran national ads in newspapers for the first time to sell her products, not only in the United States, but internationally. So she said she was the first person to actually use advertisements as a way to sell the product and market it to people. So she really was somebody, when it comes to business, who's on the cutting edge well before anybody would ever thought about it. She was doing it because that was the only way she could do it to make it work. And out of it, the story, the fact is, she was very successful. She became the first millionaire in her own right as a woman, and she's happened to also be a Black woman. So it makes it doubly important that we look at what she did and why it's important, because it actually has an effect on the things we do today.
But that's amazing. So Lewis, I think about this as a business coach, right? I work with people in different businesses, people who are starting businesses, people who are successful, people who are struggling, whatever the case. And so when I think about Madam C.J. Walker, she was like wildly successful for any person of any time, right? But she was, she also was a woman at a time, when women weren't supposed to, be in charge and, be able to manage their own money, let alone run a business. And then the fact that she was African American, and her life started so close to the end of the Civil War. I don't know if you can expound on that, but I'm just in amazement. And this kind of leads into lessons, from her life that we can apply today. I mean, I wish I could be as successful. I wish I would be as successful as she is.
Well, funny enough, she would say success is based upon the desire to succeed. It's not about the amount of money. It's about the satisfaction you get in trying to do things to help others. And she lived that, because when she started her business, one of the things she did, she wanted to look for opportunities for other women. Because at that point in time, a lot of women, especially women in the Black community, their jobs were relegated to being cooks, housekeepers, or laundresses. Well, she turned them all into entrepreneurs. They were able to create wealth in their own. And matter of fact, I don't know if you ever heard of A. Philip Randolph, but he was the founder of the Pullman Porters Union. And the only reason he could do that, though, is because of his wife. She was a Walker agent. So while he's trying to create the union, she's bringing the money into the house. And so because she was generating income and wealth, he was able to do what he did to help other people generate wealth. And the thing is, Madam Walker's big thing is about you pass it on. You help. It's like, I got here because I worked hard, and she had people who helped her. She had people who were there to support her. All the people she put around her were people who had a vision, and she wanted to pass that vision on. So everything she did was about passing it on and passing it forward. And to her, success was all about not how just what she did, but what she could do for others. And that to me is one of the biggest lessons we can have, because this is a woman who was part of the anti-lynching movement. She was part of the movement to actually go for suffrage and women's rights. At a time when there weren't many women who were actually thinking about these things. She went to the White House to meet with Woodrow Wilson, who, as much as I hate to say it, was a rabid racist. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He's the only president who was ever a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan, and actually filmed a movie called Birth of a Nation in the White House. And as a historian, a poor historian in my opinion, claimed that it was historically accurate, even though it wasn't. But he couldn't turn her away because of the fact that, one, she was wealthy, but two, she had so much influence. So she went with others to the White House to say, you need to do something to stop the lynchings. And that moved him to do some, not as much as he could, but do some. But the thing was, she built libraries. She helped build the first YWCA and YMCA in Indianapolis. She raised money to help those who were less fortunate than herself. So for her, it was all about giving back. Even though once she achieved, she had to give back and help other people rise. And really, when we talk about success, that's really even Bill Gates today, Warren Buffett. They say I've got this money, my job now is to take this money and help other people rise. It's not to just hoard it and keep it. So they're giving away billions of dollars in their lifetime, and then after their death, all this money will be given away, because they're taking that same philosophy. We're supposed to help people rise. And so people have learned from her lessons in many ways. I mean, my biggest example would be, funny enough, Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey is a person who knows the history and the story of Madam Walker very well. I don't know how many people know, but there was and we talked about this a week or two ago, there was a documentary done about Madam Walker that's on Netflix. Now, Octavia Spencer plays her in this movie, in this documentary, but the first person who actually wanted to do that was Oprah Winfrey herself. And she based her life on trying to be just like Madam Walker. Because so without Madam Walker's history, without what she did, we don't have a person like Oprah Winfrey, who, of course, is a billionaire. But the fact is, Oprah Winfrey gives a lot of money away to help those who need help. So she builds schools in Africa. She brings desks, water, food. These are the same things that Madam Walker thought were important. And so we can learn from her by actually replicating the things that she did. Education was something that she found very important. She was a woman who was functionally illiterate up until the age of 19, 20. She taught herself to speak Greek, Latin, Italian. She actually became very well educated, well versed on her own, because she didn't have the opportunity to get an education like we get today. Back then, there weren't schools for Blacks after the Civil War in the same way there were for others, and education wasn't something that was given to people who weren't in the elite. So she got herself educated, and she wanted to make sure others had that opportunity as well. So she made sure that she focused in those things. So it's one of these things where, to me, the biggest lesson we can learn from her, of course, is the fact that she did not she stood on the shoulders of those who came before her, but in a different way, because she looked at the disadvantage she had, she turned them into advantages. So she had the disadvantage. She was losing her hair because of what she was doing. Well, she figured out a way to restore that hair. And she wasn't the only person to do this, because the Poor Road Company was also going around at the same time. but she did this on her own. She worked. She didn't rely on her husband. Matter of fact, she ended up divorcing her husband because he was wasting her money, wasting her time. And she focused on enriching those people that deserved it. And to me, that's the key part. How can we enrich other people that are deserving versus enriching those who aren't deserving?
Well, that's beautiful, Lewis. I really appreciate that. And you did very well answering some of the questions that I wanted to ask you before I even got to them. So that was perfect. I have two more questions, and then what I'd like to do is allow everyone who's participating to ask you questions. So my second to last question is, when I think about this and what you've shared about the way people interacted from different ethnicities, different racial backgrounds and everything at that time. And I think about, she's been gone for more than 100 years, right? And so when I look around today, it feels like we're still struggling with issues that maybe are even worse than than the that integrated neighborhood that she was living in then. So as an anthropologist, right, someone who studies people, what can you tell us about that? What, maybe I'm looking for some hope.
Well, I would say, first of all, one of the things we learn in anthropology is that cultures adapt and change over time. And there's always struggles. We are going through a struggle today between generation, and it's really a generational struggle is how I would frame it. We've got people who are looking to the past, and as I said, they're actually fantasizing what the past was like. And in a lot of ways, it's like when I was teaching my classes, I would tell kids, students, you got people looking back to the Ozzie and Harriet, the Leave It to Beaver age, thinking that was America. What they saw in those TV shows, that was America to them, and that's what they really thought America was like. But that wasn't the reality. And the thing is, the reality is typically a lot messier than that. We have made a lot of progress in the over 106 years since Madam Walker died. Okay, and for every step we made forward, sometimes we take a step or two back, but then we move forward again. And a lot of it is generational. There is hope, as I put it. Each generation makes its mark on our society, on our culture. And if you look at, and I've got a lot of hope and optimism because I'm looking at the generations coming up today. And in some cases, they are more forward thinking than our generation or the generations of our parents or our grandparents, because they don't look at things in the same way. They're actually more open-minded in a lot of ways. Now, that's not saying that some of them aren't close-minded, because some are. But the majority are very open-minded. They're willing to look at people and take them for who they are, and not to judge them without getting to know them. They're willing to accept differences. And that's the key part. We've got to be able to accept differences, not tolerate them, but accept them. And accept that those differences are the fabric that make humanity as beautiful as what it is. Because that's the tapestry that's important to who we are. And if we're not focused on that, then that's where we get into the problems that we have, where we have racism, where we have rapid discrimination, anti-Semitism. All these things are based upon the fact that people are put people in categories, and they don't want to step out of that and actually observe them and learn about them and accept the beauty that's there.
Thank you. That is very helpful. So my last question, and unless I have another one later, is what didn't I ask you that I should have asked you? So just giving you a chance before we start hitting you up with questions from the group.
I would say probably the one question that maybe you should have asked is, why do I like doing this?
Okay.
And realistically, I mean, I spent a lot of time doing anti-racism, anti-discrimination discussions. I've talked about monuments and memorialization and how they affect us. And the fact of the matter is, for me, it's about talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly that we can see in history, and taking it and using it to learn about how we can make things better for the future. Thinking about the fact that even with all the ugliness that has happened in the past, there's a lot of beauty that also went along with it. And so taking the good, because it does outweigh the bad in a lot of ways, and realizing that for each good thing, we can create more good that will eliminate and actually eliminate the bad. Now, it's not saying that we're ever going to get rid of racism, discrimination, prejudice, because it's an inherent part of the human culture, human society. So as I used to tell my students, we're all small R racists because we tend to typically gravitate towards that is familiar. It's that big R racist that is the problem. And we can learn not to be that. We can learn to actually accept people for who they are. And that's one of the beauties about anthropology, because we spend so much time studying cultures, not just our own, but other cultures around the world. So we get to see the similarities. We see the differences, but it's the similarities that we need to embrace and understand, because that's what makes us essentially human, as we have so many similarities. The differences are fewer than the similarities.
That's great. Thank you, Lewis. So I want to be able to allow people to ask Lewis questions. Knowing many of the people, I would say most of the people who are here, I know that there are going to be a lot of questions. And Christina, I'm going to put you on the spot because you had raised your hand during this. So if you would like to ask a question, go ahead and unmute and ask away. All right. Christina, I'm not sure if you still have your question, or maybe Lewis answered it. Who else has a question for Lewis? I know there are many people here who are not shy. Kim, go ahead, unmute and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much. I thought this conversation, so far your presentation was fascinating, and I find myself that I'd like to learn more about Madam C.J. Walker. So I had a question. I read a little bit about her before the program tonight, and I know you mentioned one or two books or resources. Have you read or can you recommend the book by Tyrone McKinley Freeman,
Yes.
Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving?
Yes, actually, I can. Actually, I know Tyrone very well. We both went to the same. We both were together worked at IUPUI while I was in grad school, so I know him. That is a very good book to read. There's also one called On Her Own Ground, which was written by Olivia Bundles, who's the great granddaughter of Madam Walker.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Off. Thank you so much. I'll bookmark that one. So those will be two for my reading list. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
Amanda, go ahead, unmute and ask your question.
Well, I'm going to echo what Kim said about thank you. This is really, really fascinating. I popped on a couple of minutes late, Lewis, so you may have already addressed this, but why Madam C.J. Walker in particular? Is there a reason why you are drawn to this story, to sharing this story?
Yes, actually, I heard about her when I was younger, but never really thought about her. And then when I was in Indianapolis, I went back to school. I went back to college, and I was sitting there in Indianapolis, which is where this woman started her business, started her company. She lived. She walked the streets. Where I was walking, she walked. And I became fascinated to know more about her because I hadn't heard as much about her as I should have, in my opinion. I never remember seeing anything in any of my classes when I was going through elementary school, middle school, high school. So I started looking out for things. I had a mentor and friend who I had met when I was an undergrad. He was one of my professors. And when I got to grad school, I was talking about what can I do? Because he's the person who convinced me to become an anthropologist. I said, well, I need something to do. I need to think about what I want to do research. And we started talking and said, well, nobody's done any real work on Madam Walker. No one's done archaeology on it. No one's studied her influences, her impact on culture. So that raised the question for me is why not? And that led to me saying, this is what I want to do. And out of it, I was lucky enough to get to meet some of her family that's still living there, her descendants. But I got to actually walk the ground that she walked. To be, granted they had demolished a lot of the buildings except for the theater, but I was able to be there to actually tread on the same grounds, look at the pictures, look at the artifacts that were left from the time of Madam Walker to get a better understanding. Matter of fact, funny enough, her products are still for sale today. If you go into Sephora, you will find
Wow.
Madam Walker's line of products, the Walker products, in Sephora today.
You're kidding me. That's really incredible. And you wonder how many more of these, I'm sure that these stories are endless, not this specific one, but I love that you're uncovering this one. And, it would be so interesting to have like a different person from history, especially African American, that we could explore. That's really.
I'll be honest, there are a lot, as I tell people, history is of everybody in this country.
Yeah.
And our history is not as good as it should be. It's
Yeah.
not as varied as it should be. It's not as inclusive as it should be. I was telling Chuck and Amy earlier, I did a discussion 2 years ago. We talked about George Washington Carver and his home site and the archaeology being done there and memorialization around his life. And the fact there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of
Mhm.
stereotypes that are out there about a lot of people who've done a lot of things in history. Some of them are true, some of them are not. But the problem is, if we don't have the talks about all these people, we're
Right.
missing a major part of the story about what this country is, how it came to be. Regardless of all the good or bad, we're not talking about this country's history if we're leaving these stories out, and it should be done every day.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. Well, thank you. Beautifully put. And I'll give other people the chance to talk because I could go on to wonder how you became an anthropologist and but Chuck will kill me. But yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, great.
Wanya just asked a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Lewis.
Actually, the answer is Tawana. Yes, she had a daughter.
So Lewis, can you repeat Tawanya's question in case anybody didn't see it?
Her question was any of her family able to inherit any of her money when she died? And the answer is yes. Her daughter Lelia actually inherited the business as well as the fortune. As a matter of fact, Madam Walker moved from Indianapolis and built a mansion called Villa Lawaro, which is in upstate New York above the Catskills. She actually lived right up next to the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. And that mansion is still there today. And the owner is actually now a Black lawyer. And he opens it up for people to come see the grounds because it was built by Madam Walker. But yes, they did inherit it. Matter of fact, some of her family, Alelia's descendants, still live there in Indianapolis, and are actually some are well known. Alelia Bundles is her great granddaughter, and she was actually a producer and news person on CBS for many years before she became a author.
That's great. So Lewis, I've got to ask you, I did watch Self-Made, and so you bring up her daughter. In that, it seemed that her daughter was lesbian. Was that accurate historically?
Yes.
Okay. And so did she end up
Yes and
having
no, because
any biological children?
She didn't have any biological children. She adopted a daughter and
Mhm.
raised it. That's who would inherit everything from from Alelia when she passed. And that family line is continued. So it wasn't a biological, but it was an adopted daughter. But Alelia was actually as much of a philanthropist as her mother. She actually had a residence in Harlem. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance. So she had a lot of the famous artists and musicians of that time from the Black community were all there, and she supported them. So she carried on in much the same way as her mother did. But yes, she was. I mean, back at that time, they wouldn't have called her a lesbian. They would have said she had a friend, for example.
Yeah.
But yes, if based upon what we know, we would say yes, she was a lesbian.
Thank you. What other questions do we have? I don't want to be the only one asking questions. See, I told you I wouldn't ask another question until I asked another question. So Cedric, go ahead, ask away.
I was wondering, so is her product still being manufactured? And if so, where is it being manufactured?
Well, her product line was sold in the 1970s to Johnson Hair Products. And it was on the market for a while, then went off the market. It's just now been re-released through Sephora, the Sephora lines that were part of J.C. Penney's. I've not had a chance to see who actually is the one who's actually manufacturing them at this time, but I know that Johnson and Johnson's had bought the patents at one point in time. The reason they had to take them off the market is because actually, even though her products were very good, there were some chemicals and elements in there that probably were not the most healthy. So they had to actually update them for modern times, because there would have been arsenic and mercury were common products in makeup products and hair products of that time. So they've had to refine the process and make it safer. But they are now they are on the market again, and you can find them at the Sephora at any day of the week.
So, and Lewis, what you don't know is I think Cedric may have been asking that question for professional reasons. Cedric owns a business called the Men's Refinery here in Conyers, Georgia, which is Cedric, if I butcher this, feel free to jump back in. It's a full service men's salon, with hair, manicure, pedicure, also serves some women, and also has a line of men's clothing. So, so Cedric is absolutely living the entrepreneurial life. So, Laura, go ahead, ask away. You've got your hand raised.
Good evening, everyone. I was just reading maybe a couple of weeks ago about one of Madam C.J. Walker's salons that's in Atlanta in Sweet Auburn, that there's a hairdresser who I think is going to try and make it into a museum, and he's found some interesting things still there. If Mr. Jones could comment if he knows.
That I hadn't heard about, but I find it fascinating because I know that at the old factory, because the factory moved into the Walker building, that there are a lot of historical artifacts left from her time. Everything from the mixers that were used to make a lot of the products to some of the products and the original packaging still there. So I think actually that's a great thing, because actually those are hard to find artifacts. So funny enough, I think that the people at the Walker Theater, the Walker Incorporation, would love to know about it, because it'd be something that they would probably like to tie in with. And I could reach out and let them know. If you give me more information, I'd love to have it to let them know so that they could possibly work with them.
Okay, thank you.
That's really cool. And so, Lewis, that's something that came out in the movie. And again, it's a docudrama. It's always, you always wonder how much is historically accurate. But so not only did she have products, right? But she basically, it seems like she almost had like a franchising model for people to open salons.
What she created was the Walker School of Beauty. And she had these in different places throughout the United States. Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Atlanta, New York, Philadelphia, LA, for example, where women could come in and learn how to use the products, how to actually use them on other women, so they could actually become beauticians themselves. So they were trained how to use the products, how to sell the products. And in most cases, they would go back and start their own beauty salons. And out of those beauty salons, they would be taking care of doing the makeup, skin treatments, hair treatments, but then they would be selling those products to these women so they could have them for their ongoing use at home. So she taught them not only to be beauticians, but to be entrepreneurs, to be saleswomen themselves, to actually buy the products from her and then turn around and make money from themselves to make a business that was going to take care of. So it put a lot of these people into what would have been the middle class for that time, who otherwise would not have been the middle class.
That's great. That's great. Who else has a question? Is anybody, Cedric, raising your hand again? Thank you.
I was just wondering, the location where her factory were, where you did the archaeology, the digs, are they planning to do anything with that site that you're aware of?
Actually, unfortunately, I've already done something. I got in to do my archaeological work in the summer of 2009, and we rushed to get it done. We wanted to get it done because there were hints that they were going to take the sites and they were looking to remove them and build on them. Well, they've actually built condominiums on those sites. So now that site is covered with housing. All the artifacts that we recovered are actually now sitting at going to the State Museum. I've actually been back and doing some work because I took my log, because I've got all my archaeology logs. I've got students who are now graduate students working, continuing work on what I started. And I will probably go back and do some more work over time on them as I get time. But we're doing some work on them to try to see what more stories we can tell. So all the artifacts are now being stored so that they've been saved. Because we don't want to lose them because the site is gone. We can no longer go back and do archaeology because of the fact they built the condominiums, unfortunately.
Hmm. So that's really fortunate that you got in when you did, right? Because
Yes,
there's
it was.
so many things that are just lost to time.
Well, and as I say, archaeology in its nature is destructive. And doing archaeology, we're destroying archaeology because of the simple fact that we've got to dig into the site. And once we're finished, nothing's going to be the same. Even once we put that soil back, you can't tell a new story at all. And I saw that Christina had a question. Who else have I done research on? Actually, some of my other research actually has been done just on families. Some of the families who lived in and around Madam Walker. One of the main ones was her lawyer, Mr. Ransom, who lived about 3 blocks over into what's now called Ransom Place. He was one of the main people that she did her business with. He was one of the only men involved in her company. Everybody who worked for Madam Walker in her company was a woman, except for Mr. Ransom. He was the only man. He was her lawyer. He was her friend, and basically she trusted him among everything. And her daughter the same way. And so I want to understand as much about him as I could because they named a whole section of the nearby side after him. Unfortunately, that led to some of my other research on urban development, gentrification, housing, and how housing decisions during the urban renewal period affected marginalized groups and specifically African American groups, Latino groups, indigenous populations in the cities and towns that they were going into. Actually, and myself, along with my mentor, we published a number of papers on that as well.
So Laura, thank you for the note. I captured it for Lewis to get it to him after the event. So now, Lewis, I'm going to go back to the Self-Made movie. It wasn't covered with a lot of time on screen, but her lawyer and trusted business guide, Mr. Ransom, right? That was his name.
Yes.
Yeah. In the movie, it showed that a friend of his who was helping his son was lynched. Was that historically accurate? And is that part of it? It seemed like that had it in the movie. They played it that had a profound effect on her.
It did. It's what actually pushed her towards the anti-lynching movement. Funny enough, the last lynching before the lynching that happened in Texas in the 2000s, the last lynching occurred in Indiana in 1987 in Muncie, Indiana. And so Madam Walker living in Indiana, where as much as I'd say it was a common thing, almost to a T until the fall of the Ku Klux Klan in the mid-20s. It was something that was unfortunately common. She had enough when it struck close to home. It had a profound effect on her. It made her want to speak out even more virulently against it. So much so that it's part of what forced her to finally speak with others, and then eventually go to the White House, go to the president and say he needed to do something about it. So yes, it is historical. It did have an effect on her. And the thing is, Madam Walker was someone who actually looked for the good in people. She didn't want to see people suffer. And and it didn't matter if they were her race or not. She wanted the best for everybody. And that was something that people have to understand. She did a lot for the Black community, but she did a lot for America through what she did, because she allowed people to actually pull themselves up and to create livelihoods that they would not have been able to do. And that in turn enriched the communities in which they lived. So her story is truly an American story. It's one that, unfortunately, it took how many years to get the documentary made. And as a matter of fact, they said that because it was on Netflix, nobody was going to watch it. Because, and the sad part is, more people need to see it just to understand who she is, what she did. I told all my students, especially male and female, when I was teaching, that one of the things they have to understand is, without people like Madam Walker, none of us would have the opportunities we have today, because they set the stage by being brave enough to take the steps they did, to fight against the odds that they did. They set the bar very high for us to try to achieve. And when I say achieve, not monetarily, not socioeconomically, but to achieve as individuals, as people, to actually make society better. And that's one of the things I think she did that is very unique and different. And we could probably find other examples. I'm not going to say she's the only one who did it, but she's a unique story because of the time in which she came from, what she had to come through to get where she did. And then it wasn't all about her. It's about, what can I do to help others who have got nothing? I want them to be able to have the same opportunities that I've created for myself. And that's a unique story.
That's really great, Lewis. I appreciate that. We are almost at the end of our time. So I want to, just in case anyone has been hanging around, dying to ask one last question, I'll give that kind of last call for anybody who's got a pressing question that they would like to ask. All right, seeing none, Lewis, I would like to give you an opportunity to take a couple of minutes to kind of wrap this up for us. And let me just say, I greatly appreciate this. Lewis and I had about a 2.5-hour meeting at a brew pub last year. It's the first time we'd seen each other in, I don't know, 30 to 40 years, and had a wonderful conversation. And we didn't drink beer the whole time. We did limit ourselves, but I could have stayed there for 5 or 6 hours just listening to the insights that you have to share. And, maybe I'll press you into doing another webinar with us on a related topic in the future. But, please, Lewis, thank you. And please, anything you'd like to say to wrap us up here?
First, I want to say thank you, Chuck, for asking me. Thank you, everybody, for attending. The big thing I would like everybody to take away is, when we think about the past, whether we're looking at it through an archaeological lens, a cultural anthropological lens, a societal lens, whether we're looking at it through a historical lens, one of the things, the lessons we have to take away is the fact that it's a human story. Humans make mistakes, humans are fallible. But the one thing we do very well is we do create beauty. And that is one of the reasons why the question was, someone said they wish they could ask me why I became an anthropologist. It's because I see the beauty in humanity. Anthropology is all about studying people. That's all we focus on. In ways we look at it, whether we're looking at it archaeologically, through culture, through language, actually through their bodies, their remains, medically. And for me, it's all about understanding humans and how we can better interrelate with each other. And if we learn that lesson, that we can interrelate with each other, not that we can tolerate each other, that we can respect, appreciate, and accept one another, I think that makes the world a better place.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Lewis. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this. I really appreciate you being here and participating in this. It means a lot to me. Lewis, for all you shared, and everybody for being here to share in this event. So good night, everyone. God bless you. Love to all of you, and thank you, Lewis. Can't
Oh,
thank you enough.
Thank you.
Goodbye now.